Very small role this morning to kind of talk a little about logistics. So in our auditorium, the emergency exits are in the front and rear of the auditorium, so please take note of that. Additionally, the restrooms are right where you entered in the lobby there. So if you need a restroom, you just make your way to the back of the auditorium. At the conclusion of today's presentation, Dr. Hamilton will be signing his book down here at the table, and then we'll ask that you exit through the rear of the auditorium. We hope that you enjoyed today's event, despite the weather. So you have nothing else going on today, so we're excited to have such a great, healthy crowd. So I'm pleased to introduce the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, formerly known as the Fort George Alliance, John Denuzio. And John will go through a few other aspects of this morning's program. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Fran, and good morning, everyone. As Fran said, the weather isn't delightful, but we have our passionate history followers here, which I was telling Dr. Hamilton about yesterday, particularly Knox. Now, many of you were in attendance. We did a program with the Warren County folks last winter that featured Fort Ty coming down, giving an excellent presentation. Knox, I'd say, is probably on par with Benedict Arnold as in terms of the popularity of topics, and certainly Dr. Hamilton's expertise is particularly welcome here today. Tells more about Knox, particularly the correspondences between him and his wife Lucy. But before I go on, I did want to first of all thank Fran and the Lake George High School staff for granting us the use of the beautiful auditorium and also for making it as comfortable as can be given this weather. Also should thank Fort William Henry and the Holiday Inn Resort Lake George, both of which have contributed in kind to this event and several other events that we do. So our thanks go to them as well as of course to Dr. Hamilton for trekking up here. Now he lives in Newport News, Virginia, and this is kind of like the promised land for a Knox aficionado. And particularly in winter, he was very excited about, I want to be up here, at the time of year when Knox himself was experiencing these things, which kind of gives you a little bit of concern about his sanity. But perhaps you get to go home tomorrow. We'll see. But I want to also reiterate that you saw with our greeters from the Alliance and the Warren County Commission a number of handouts, and we're advocating certainly the public come to our events of the Alliance. And as you can see, we have a pretty substantial list of events already planned for the first half of 2024. We hope you'll avail yourselves of them. And for members only, we have some very special events that are described in that handout. So check it out. I won't enumerate them again at this point, but they're pretty attractive. And the members-only things, I think, are real special events that the history buffs will want to follow. The other materials we have out there, of course, are handouts, some of which are going to be refreshed in time for the season. But certainly the Colonial Wars Guide, if you haven't seen that before, gives you a history of the whole village of Lake George and surrounding areas, including the Battlefield Park, Fort William Henry, what occurred here in the village, in particular where Montcalm's, the breastworks that he had constructed in advance of the siege of Fort William Henry, and many other sites in town. And we have our Lake George Battlefield Park tour guide itself. One of the members of our board, esteemed colleague, is a guy who has authored several books and also runs, I think, America's premier history tour company. And he has a very special event that's germane to what our discussion is about today that I'd like to have him tell you about. Dr. Bruce Mentor. Bruce.
Well, I had to tell you, first of all, I do live in Lake George at Still Bay from May to October. And then I retreat to Virginia. Because in Virginia, so far we've had 1 inch of snow, and it was going by noontime. That's why I live in Virginia. Anyway, we have some exciting handouts for you up in front. If you didn't get one, our annual conference on the American Revolution has been called the premier conference on that type of subject. And so please take one of our postcards. It's going to be in March. You might still have snow on the ground here in March, so you might want to get to Virginia. And we've got a dynamite lineup of historians. Many of them have won incredible prizes for the books that they have written. So I commend the postcard to you. And we are going to offer a Knox tour. This yellow sheet is out there. And Phillip Hamilton is going to do the tour for us. It's not going to be in the winter. It's going to be in June. So you don't have to worry about snow, sleet, or ice, or whatever. And so take a look at that. And we have a promotion going today only. If you sign up for the Knox tour, there's a 15% discount on the cost of the bus tour. But it's for 3 days, and you go out 8 hours a day, and you're going to see everything you want to know about Henry Knox and the noble train of artillery. So please take a look at that flyer, and if you're interested, I'll be able to provide more information after Dr. Hamilton's talk. Thanks very much, John.
Thank you, Bruce. And you know, we always say tongue-in-cheek that America's History LLC is America's premier tour company, but it really is.
It's not tongue-in-cheek, it's true.
All right, tongues out then. But I've done several tours with Bruce and his firm, World War II, Civil War, of course, Revolution, French and Indian War, and they're all first rate. So hopefully many of you will be able to join me and several other history buffs on that tour. Our next presider, if you will, is the Warren County historian, who's the co-president of the Warren County Historical Society and the secretary of the Warren County Commission for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, Dr. Stan Sinferano. Stan.
I'm here to welcome you from the Commission to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. There are several Commission members here. Would you raise your hands so people can recognize you and pounce on you when you come, when you leave? And I welcome you from the County of Warren, one of 14 counties in the United States named for Joseph Warren. And for the Warren County Historical Society, which is in the process of forming the Joseph Warren Museum on Gurney Lane, not far from here. Look for more information on that. I want to also encourage you, if you didn't when you came in, to sign up so that you can get on the email list for the Commission on the 250th and get a note in your email when some of the events come close. We have one scheduled for March. Clifford Oliver from Greenwich is a reenactor, and he's going to be doing a talk on Jack, who was a slave from the Mabee Farms, who came up here several times to bring food to the troops. We also have a colonial dinner planned for February 29th. It's an extra day, so you don't have anything else to do. For $60, you can have a wonderful dinner prepared by the culinary students at Adirondack Community College. Look for information on that or talk to one of us before you leave. We're taking reservations and it's limited to 60 people. And the choice of food is food that would have been available at the time of the Revolution. And it's at the Seasons Restaurant, downtown Glens Falls. Okay, now, you didn't come to hear us, but you came to hear Dr. Hamilton. So John, I'm turning it back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Stan. Yes, Dr. Phillip Hamilton is originally from northern New Jersey, which I did not know until this week. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Gettysburg College, which sounds like nirvana to our older senses. How wonderful that must have been to be a history major going to Gettysburg College. I believe he received a master's degree from George Washington University in Washington, and then a doctorate from Washington University in St. Louis. He's written several books, the most relevant of which today, which is available for sign and signature, is The Revolutionary War Lives and Letters of Lucy and Henry Knox. He's currently a professor of history at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, and is writing a biography now of Henry Knox. But while we're here today, and what we look forward to hearing is more about the correspondences between the Knoxes. Dr. Phillip Hamilton.
All right, well, thank you everyone for, and I want to thank John for that nice introduction. I also want to thank John for inviting me and for dedicating yesterday to seeing all the historical sites around here. In particular, we found the Henry Knox monument at Sabbath Day Point, so I was very excited to find that. But I also want to thank Fran, Stan, and John for their gracious hospitality as well, and I've really enjoyed myself since I've been here. And I want to thank all of you for coming on such an inclement day. If the weather here had been transferred to Virginia, I could say it probably just would have been me and John here today. But I do appreciate your heartiness in terms of coming out to hear me talk today. Okay, on November 16th, 1775, Henry Knox was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, then the headquarters of the Continental Army. And as Knox settled into his small camp tent that evening, he was wet through and through. He had just ridden through a terrible nor'easter. But he had met earlier that day with his commander-in-chief, General George Washington. And Knox found himself in a state of both high excitement and profound uneasiness. And he realized that he had to write first and foremost about his meeting with Washington to his young wife, Lucy, who was then 40 miles away in Worcester. Now, just a few words about the images that you see of Henry Knox right there, and that's Lucy. The painting of Henry Knox, that was done by Charles Wilson Peale. It was done at Valley Forge in early 1778. So that's probably what Knox looked like when he engaged in the Ticonderoga expedition. Lucy Knox, unfortunately there is no surviving painting of her, so all we have is this silhouette of her. executed in the 1790s, so it's about 20 years after the period in which we're discussing. And I think it was a satirical image of her during Knox's, when he was Secretary of War in Philadelphia. But at any rate, those are the images that we have of them. But Knox, he wrote to his wife, he dashed off a short letter to his wife that evening. And he began with, he wrote her a short but tender note, and he began with, quote, "the most tender inquiries concerning my dear girl's health." And he urged her to keep up your spirits, as I shall be with you tomorrow. You see, the couple had recently learned that Lucy was pregnant with their first child. Now, pregnancy was an event that typically brought both joy and anxiety to most young couples in the 18th century. But Lucy was deeply stressed not only by her initial pregnancy, but she was also stressed by the fact that she was separated not only from her husband, but she was also separated from her parents. She had heard nothing from her parents since the Revolution began, and when she left them behind in Boston when Henry and Lucy evacuated Boston after Lexington and Concord. And then Knox wrote to her, "Don't be alarmed when I tell you that the general has ordered me to go to the westward, as far as Ticonderoga, about a 3-week journey." Aware also of her constant fear for his safety, he quickly added, "Don't be afraid, there is no fighting." Now, how did this letter come to be written, and equally as important, who were Lucy and Henry Knox? Well, Henry Knox is probably most famous as Washington's artillery commander throughout the Revolutionary War, and he obviously served later in Washington's first cabinet as Secretary of War. Less well known is the fact that Henry had married Lucy Flucker Knox. Now, Lucy Flucker Knox was the daughter of a high-ranking Massachusetts colonial official, Thomas Flucker, and Flucker was also a staunch loyalist, as were Lucy's entire family, including her mother, Hannah Flucker. Hence, they remained behind when the war began. They remained behind in Boston. Now, Lucy and Henry have left us a marvelous archive of letters and records from throughout the Revolutionary War, all of which are housed in the Gilder-Lehrman collection located in the New York Historical Society. And the couple's letters, if you read them carefully, they reveal that both their lives underwent a series of dramatic transformations in just about every way imaginable. Now, we don't have many complete sets of letters between Revolutionary era couples, especially those that span the entire war, but the Knox's letters do. And they wrote several hundred letters to one another during the Revolutionary War. And about 100 of these letters are reproduced and annotated in a book that I wrote and edited entitled The Revolutionary War Lives and Letters of Lucy and Henry Knox. Now, today I'm going to be speaking to you about the couple's separation during Henry's famous Ticonderoga expedition. And here I'm going to focus particularly on Henry's correspondence to Lucy during this period, during the winter of 75 and 76. Now, unfortunately, no letters survive from Lucy during this period, and in fact, it's unknown if she even wrote any letters to her husband during this period. And I think it was probably because, given the couple's belief that Henry would constantly be on the move during his journeys, that the chances of him receiving a letter from her were pretty remote. So that leads me to believe that she probably did not write any letters to him. Nevertheless, this leads me to the first question I just asked. How did this specific letter of November 16, 1775 come to be written? Well, the true origins of this letter date back to 1772, when Lucy and Henry first met. And they met inside of Knox's bookstore. Knox had opened a bookstore called the London Bookstore in 1771, and the following year in walks Lucy Flucker, and it was love at first sight. This was a true romance, and they fell deeply in love very quickly, and they remained deeply in love until Henry's death many years later. Now, because Knox was a man from a very humble family and a tradesman to boot, Lucy's parents were none too pleased about this romance. But Lucy herself, she was a very, very determined woman, and she persisted until her father finally gave his consent. And so the couple married in June of 1774. Now, Knox's political beliefs and activities before the Revolutionary War are a bit murky, but he was undoubtedly viewed by the Boston population as someone who was at least sympathetic to the Patriot cause. And shortly after Lexington had conquered, Knox made his political sentiments abundantly known when he and Lucy left the city. And Knox volunteered for the colonial army then forming in and around Boston, or around Boston, I should say. Now, in early July, Knox was working on the construction of some defensive fortifications in nearby Roxbury, which is in south of Boston, when he happened to come upon General George Washington. Washington had arrived in Cambridge on July 2nd, and on July 6th he was making one of his first inspection tours of the armed forces over which he had just assumed command. And he talked to Knox, and he was very impressed by Knox's his engineering skills, as well as by Knox's can-do attitude. And Washington set out to get to know Knox better. And as he got to know him, he discovered not only that Knox being a bookseller, but he also learned that Knox was a voracious and an incisive reader, particularly in military engineering and in artillery. Therefore, Washington became a staunch advocate for Knox and for his rise. Indeed, with Washington's backing, Knox, by the end of 1775, had received a commission as a colonel in the Continental Army, as well as being named commander of the Army's artillery regiment. Nevertheless, both Knox and Washington understood in late 1775 that in truth there were precious few guns that to be had in and around Cambridge. Indeed, there were only a dozen or so heavy field pieces, field guns, and just a handful of lighter artillery pieces. And both men realized that that was inadequate to compel the British out of Boston. And both men also realized that the Continental Army suffered from an equally desperate shortage of shells and gunpowder. And therefore, on November 16th, Washington attempted to solve these problems. And he ordered Knox on November 16th to travel first to New York City, where Knox was to lobby the president of its provincial congress to send to the American Army up in around Boston, as many heavy cannon as that were present in New York, as well as much ammunition as possible. And then Knox was to trek northward to Fort Ticonderoga, which was located 95 miles north of Albany. And there, and as everyone knows, Fort Ticonderoga lay near the southern tip of Lake Champlain. Now, the one-time British fortification had been captured the previous May by several detachments of Patriot militia. And these Patriot militia found inside of Ticonderoga a large array of cannon, mortars, and howitzers. And so Knox was ordered to travel there to examine these artillery pieces, to select the best heavy guns, which he thought could help the Continental Army break the siege of Boston. And then, in the dead of winter, Knox was to organize their transportation back to the American encampment centered around Cambridge. Now, the next day, after receiving his orders, on the next day, November 17th, Knox went to Worcester. He saw Lucy and he bid her farewell. Now, as of yet, Knox had no staff nor fellow officers to travel with him, and so he hired a young farmer, a man by the name of Miller, who lived near Worcester, to travel with him on this trek and to serve sort of as an aide-de-camp and as a personal servant. And then, after starting off, Miller and Knox, they soon fell in. As soon as they left Boston, they soon fell in with two gentlemen who were also on their way to New York City. And a day or so later, the foursome, they came upon Knox's younger brother who was on the road coming in the opposite direction. Now, unfortunately, Knox's brother was William Knox. Unfortunately, there is no painting of him, no surviving images of William Knox. So this guy whose head is turned is going to have to serve as our image for William Knox. But William and Henry, they met on the road, and in a sense, this turned the Ticonderoga expedition into a family affair. You see, William Knox was Henry's only living blood relation. Even though Knox was only in his mid-20s, he had lost by that point in time his father and his mother. Also, 8 of his 9 brothers had died. And so naturally, William and Henry were very, very close. And just before the war, William had even worked in Knox's bookshop. And so Knox, he wrote to Lucy about their meeting on the road to New York City. And he wrote, our meeting was truly farcical. He began this account in his letter to Lucy. You see, Knox decided, unwisely in retrospect, to have a bit of fun at his 19-year-old brother's expense. And so continuing on with the letter, he spoke first, William spoke first, and I told him I did not know him. What lad is it who has the impudence to accost me so familiarly? I don't know you. Who is it? My being in company and with strangers, and thus putting him to open shame, wrought so powerfully in his breast that it raised such a whirlwind of passion in it that it was with the utmost difficulty I could prevent him from putting himself to death with a dagger. Now, I believe this was one of the first instances, or first manifestations, at least in writing, of William's unstable and troubled personality. William would repeatedly have bouts of mental illness later on in life, and I think this was the first incident of it. And Knox certainly found himself shaken by his brother's activities, or his response to his teasing. And Knox understood that he was essentially responsible for his brother's well-being. And so he somehow convinced William to accompany, to join the party, and to become a part of the expedition. And so Knox finished his account to Lucy. He said, he, William, is now well reconciled and will conduce to make my journey agreeable. And I must say, after this one incident, William did prove his worth to Henry during the expedition. Now, historians, they often ignore Knox's initial excursion to New York City during the Ticonderoga journey, and I don't plan on discussing it in much detail, but I think some passages in his later letters to Lucy are certainly make for interesting reading. And I also think these passages that I'm about to quote to you show Henry's pride in being a New Englander, as well as his prejudice against all things New York. Now, Henry wrote this letter on January 5th, 1776, he was in Albany at the time, and it was one of the few times during the expedition where he had a few free moments, spare moments, and so he naturally wanted to spend those moments with Lucy. If he couldn't be with her in person, at least he could be with her in writing. And so he wrote to her, a little about my travels. New York is a place where I think in general the houses are better than in Boston. They are generally of brick, three stories high, with the largest kind of windows. Their churches are grand, their colleges and workhouse and hospitals most excellently situated, and also exceedingly commodious. Their principal streets are much wider than ours. But then he really began to show his feeling about New Yorkers. Why the people are magnificent in their equipages, which are numerous, in their house furniture, which is fine, in their pride and conceit, which are inimitable, in their profaneness, which is intolerable, and in their want of principle, which is prevalent, in their Toryism, which is unsufferable, and for which they must repent in dust and ashes. So in case you haven't figured out, Henry didn't care much for New Yorkers. And I think his anger at New Yorkers stemmed in part from his failure of his mission in New York City to secure as many guns and ammunition for Washington's army as possible. Basically, the New York Provincial Congress kind of thumbed their nose at Knox's request. And so when Henry left the city, he did depart the city on November 28th, and he scribbled into a small diary he kept, glad to leave New York, it being very expensive. So some things never change. Now, the day before he departed, he did write Lucy a long and a quite tender letter. This is the letter in which he eventually would tell the story about his encounter with William. But this letter also reveals, I think, the deep abiding love that Lucy and Henry had for one another. And he began it with this I find it a very charming opening passage. My greatest happiness, blessed be the name of him who first instituted the art of writing, by which we can, at a distance, converse familiarly with those whom we most tenderly love. My mind, at this moment, has very grateful sensations toward him. And then he asks her, how does my dear Lucy, how does my dear Lucy, her Harry is and was all anxious for her safety. Keep up your spirits, my Lucy. Preserve your health by every means in your power, for the sake of the youth who values you above all else, above all earthly blessings. And so he really did care about her, and he was very concerned about her because she was pregnant at the time, and he was worried about it. And then he wrote to her, I shall leave this place, New York City, tomorrow for Ticonderoga, and shall make every possible dispatch to return to my lovely girl. Now, that same night that Knox wrote to Lucy on the 27th of November, he also penned a highly detailed letter to General Washington, in which he naturally closed in a more serious vein, writing, I shall set out by land tomorrow morning for Ticonderoga and proceed with the utmost dispatch, as knowing our whole dependence for Henry Cannon will be from that part. And this began a pattern that I found throughout the expedition of Knox writing to both Lucy and Washington on the same day. And you see, Knox understood the priority that a letter to General Washington would receive from dispatch riders. And so he always made sure to place a letter to Lucy in the same dispatch pouches before sending them off, because he realized that her letters would get to her much more quickly. Now, on December 1st, Knox, William, and Miller, they entered Albany. They reached Albany by the 1st, whereupon Knox immediately found himself captivated by Albany's commercial possibilities, so much so that he would predict to Lucy that Albany, from its situation, commanding the trade of the lakes and its immense territories westward, must one day be, if not the capital, yet nearly to it, of America. So Knox, was realizing the possibilities of the Erie Canal about a half century before the Erie Canal opened. And then the party headed northward toward Fort Ticonderoga and a planned rendezvous with 42-year-old Philip Schuyler, General Philip Schuyler. Now, Schuyler was a French and Indian War veteran and one of the Hudson Valley's largest landowners. And as a result, he was extremely powerful in New York politics, and due to his influence, the Continental Congress had named him to command the Northern Department. And on the 4th of December, Knox reached Fort George, which lay, as we all know, at the southern tip of Lake George. And as everyone else knows here, Lake George is a narrow body of water. It's 32 miles in length, stretching from south to north, and near its northern end lay Fort Ticonderoga. Now, arriving at Fort George on the southern end of the lake, Knox found himself greeted not only by Schuyler, but also by a bearded civilian named John Becker. Now, Becker would prove to be very important to the expedition. Becker was one of the most experienced teamsters in the Albany region, and he knew how to haul heavy loads through narrow, densely wooded trails, as well as across treacherous, snow-covered mountains. Therefore, Schuyler had hired Becker to take charge of the 45 or so teamsters, which the general had also hired for the mission. Now, the Northern commander and Becker had themselves returned from Ticonderoga, where they had been examining the guns at the fort. And they delivered to Knox, they brought to Knox an inventory of their size, the gun's sizes, their calibers, their weight, and their condition. And then after this meeting, in a brief letter that Knox wrote to Lucy the following morning, he mentioned, however, none of this. He didn't mention his meeting with Schuyler, he didn't mention his meeting with Becker, he didn't mention the inventory that he received. He mentioned none of this primarily because he was about to sail up to Ticonderoga himself, and so he was pressed for time. And so now first of all, he apologized for writing such a short note, but he explained, "I am in the greatest hurry. The batteries are waiting for me." But he did alert her to the fact in this very short note, it's just a few lines long, but he did alert her that he was safe, he had arrived safely at Lake George, and that he remained in good health, because that's above all what she wanted to hear. And then he asked her what he most wanted to know from her, the state of her mental and physical health. And he continued on in this brief note, "I hope in God you keep up your spirits and are in perfect health. Before closing, believe me, I think continually of you. God preserve you." Now, the great missing piece in all of this, in this exchange, is, and in all of these Ticonderoga letters, is what exactly was Lucy, what was her attitude, and what was she exactly thinking? Again, I suspect she probably did not write any letters during this expedition. Throughout the expedition, Knox never mentioned receiving any letters from her, which he would always do in the future whenever he received a letter from her in the field. But nevertheless, I think it's really not that hard to figure out how she felt. Indeed, she was pregnant. She was alone in eastern Massachusetts. She had been abandoned by her parents, her siblings, and here was her husband of only 18 months, now away on a dangerous mission from which he might not return. And so Henry was concerned about her mental state. And I think his constant references to her health also point to the fact that he was worried about her pregnancy and her health during her pregnancy. Now, we know from later letters during Lucy's subsequent pregnancies that she was oftentimes ill. She often became quite sick during her pregnancies. And so I think this first bout of childbirth was probably no different. So one can just imagine the emotional strain that was placed not only on Lucy, during Henry's absence, but also Knox's constant worry for his wife's mental and physical health. Now, in a letter to Washington drafted the same day, December 5th, Knox succinctly summed up all of the hurdles and all of the difficulties he was confronting. Indeed, he wrote to Washington that day, "The garrison is so weak at Ticonderoga, the conveyance from the fort to the landing so indifferent, and the passage across the lake so precarious that I'm afraid it will be 10 days at least before we get them," i.e. the guns, "on the south side of the lake. When they are here," meaning at Fort George, "the conveyance from hence will depend entirely on sledding. If it is good, they shall immediately move forward without good sledding. The roads are so much gully that it will be impossible to move a step." Now I want you to note that Knox mentioned none of these challenging difficulties in his letter to his wife Lucy. And I think he did not mention those because he did not want her to worry about him unnecessarily, or he did not want to unnecessarily burden her with his worries. Now Knox was unable to write to either Washington or to Lucy for another 12 days, but when he did write again to them on December 17th, Knox was back at Fort George. Now in the interim, between December 5th and December 17th, Knox had been very, very busy. It had been one of these periods of frenetic activity during his expedition. He had sailed up the lake in between these dates. He had sailed up the lake. He had visited Ticonderoga. He had selected 59 guns to transport back to the Army around Boston. He had dragged those guns overland the 4 miles from Fort Tide to the lake, to Lake George. He had overseen their loading onto 45 bateaux, and he had gotten all of the guns, 120,000 pounds of ordnance in all, to Fort George by water, all in the dead of winter, all while confronting heavy snow and contrary winds the entire way. Now to Washington, Knox wrote on the 17th of December, "It is not easy to conceive the difficulties we have had in getting them over the lake, owing to the advanced season of the year and contrary winds. 3 days ago, it was very uncertain whether we could have gotten them over until next spring, but now, please God, they shall go." On the other hand, when he wrote to Lucy, he wrote Lucy a very different he wrote Lucy a very different account of his journey down the lake. He simply wrote, "In coming back, that is down Lake George, it was exceedingly disagreeable, but all danger and the principal difficulty is now past, and by next Thursday I hope I shall be able to set out from hence on our way home." Once again, he's thinking about what she wants and needed to hear. Number one, that her husband was safe, and two, that he would soon be heading home toward her to see her. Now, just to give you some indication of the difficulties that Knox and his men experienced during this stage of the expedition, I did want to share a letter that Knox's brother William wrote to Henry on December 14th. This was in the midst of the transfer of the guns down the lake on those 45 bateaux. Now, I mentioned earlier William's mental health issues beforehand, but after this initial outburst, William did prove to be nothing but a reliable team player, and he did contribute mightily to Knox's success. And Henry trusted William enough to put William, in charge of bringing up the rear of the lake crossing. That is, William was responsible for making sure that all of the guns gathered at Lake George's North Landing were safely and properly loaded. He was also responsible to make sure the vessels were adequately manned before departing. And then William set off on the last vessel on the 14th. And he wrote Henry an account of his departure. He wrote, we got off the scow and immediately set out for Sabbath Day Point, which is, I think as everyone knows, is a point about approximately a third of the way down the lake, where we arrived in the evening, beating all the way against the winds. Monday morning, our scow sank, but luckily so near the shore that when she sank, her gunwale was above water, so that yesterday we were able to bail her out and tow her toward the leeward shore to the point where we took out 3 mortars, and by hauling the cannon aft, balanced her, and now she stands ready to sail for the first fair wind. So one can just imagine the Herculean effort it took to do all this, all in the bitter cold, all in the snow and the wind. And so I think it points to the difficulties that Knox was referring to. And Knox took the lead boat down Lake George, and it took Knox 2 days to reach Fort George after he departed, and he had a difficult time as well, as we know from his diary accounts. But again, Knox mentioned none of this in his letters to Lucy because he did not want to burden her with his hardships. Now, Knox did add in his letter to Lucy of the 17th a very interesting line about a very different subject altogether. And these lines have sparked a lot of controversy ever since. He wrote to his wife, "I have had the pleasure of seeing a considerable number of our enemies prisoners to the bravery of America, enemies who would not before this allow the Americans a spark of military virtue, but their note is now changed. There are some to be much pitied, others not so much." Now, a note that was later added by a historian or someone in the mid-19th century noted that these prisoners were captured up in Canada during American operations up there, and they were being transferred to Pennsylvania for imprisonment. Now, among these British soldiers who were captured might have been a young British lieutenant named John Andre, who, of course, would 5 years later become famous or infamous as the go-between for Benedict Arnold and British commanding General Sir Henry Clinton. And after Andre's capture by American irregulars, he was tried and executed by hanging. He was tried before a board of American officers, which included Henry Knox. Now, during the 19th century, a story emerged about Andre and Knox having shared a room and perhaps even a bed together, that December at Fort George. And the story further points out that these two men talked late into the night and that they formed a real connection. And that, of course, naturally makes Andre's end all the more tragic. Now, sad to say, as much as we might want it to be true, there is no evidence that this meeting ever happened. Now, I realize that Matt Cagle gave a very interesting lecture about the supposed meeting between Henry Knox and John Andre at Fort George at last year's American Revolution seminar at Fort Ty, but he also found no evidence of this encounter ever taking place. And I must say, I've always been skeptical about it, simply because Knox never mentioned it in his letters to Lucy. He never mentioned it in December 1775, and he never mentioned it in 1780 after Andre's execution. And given the closeness of the couple, it would make sense to me that he certainly would have mentioned that they had met, especially if they had formed such a close connection. Now, as Knox wrapped up his letter to Lucy on the 17th, this was his third letter to her since he had left a month before, he cheerfully looked ahead to the time when they would be together again. And he also looked ahead cheerfully to the time when he would deliver those guns. And he kind of joked, "We shall cut no small figure in going through the county with our cannon, mortars, etc., drawn by 80 yoke oxen." Now, of course, he wished he could be with her right now on the 17th, and so he finished his letter. Had I the power to transport myself to you, how eagerly rapid would be my flight. It makes me smile to think how I should look, like a tennis ball, ball down. And so Knox was wanted to convey to her how much he wanted to be with her. Now, after Knox dispatched his letters to both Washington and to Lucy, he was silent for the next 2.5 weeks. This was his second period of frenetic activity, and during this period, Knox had, he was constantly on the move. He was very, very busy, and now during the last days of December, in spite of a number of hiccups, which we don't have time to go into, but in spite of a number of hiccups, Knox was able to successfully work with General Schuyler and wagon master John Becker to oversee the gathering of the sleds, the teamsters, the oxen, and the horses. And in late December, Knox organized the 42 sleds that he had on hand for the operation. He organized them into 5 separate divisions, and then each division set off initially for Albany. Now Knox, when he set off with Becker in the lead division toward the end of December, and they first went to Glen Falls, and at Glen Falls, Knox left Becker and he rode on ahead to the Mohawk River, to the planned crossing of the Mohawk River, and there Knox checked on the thickness of the ice to see if the ice would be thick enough over the Mohawk to support his guns. Now, unfortunately, when Knox arrived at the Mohawk, he noted in his diary that a cruel thaw had begun. The temperature had warmed considerably on New Year's Day, 1776, and that warm-up just increased Henry's anxieties considerably. And so he immediately had to hire a number of local citizens to cut holes in the ice at key points, because that was an age-old technique for strengthening weak ice. And then on January 4th, when Knox was in Albany, Knox then, after he strengthened the ice on the Mohawk, he traveled to Albany to wait for news of Becker's arrival. And on January 4th, he did receive the good news that Becker's lead group of sleds had arrived at the crossing, the Half Moon Crossing, ferry crossing at the Mohawk. Now, he learned later that same day, January 4th, that one of Becker's sleds had broken through the ice. And so that forced Becker to put a halt to the crossings, and he had to find another ferry. But fortunately, because of Becker's skill as a teamster, he was able not only to rescue the cannon and the oxen who had fallen into the river, but he was also able to find an alternative crossing point 7 miles to the west. And there, all of the cannon made it safely over. And over the next several days, the expedition's other divisions, following the wagon master's lead, they all crossed the Mohawk River at that alternative ferry site. And afterwards, because of the ongoing thaw, which lasted into the first week of January, Becker and Knox reluctantly decided they had no choice but to wait in Albany for the warm-up to end and for a cold snap to begin. Now, it was during this period when Henry was waiting in Albany for a cold snap to come over that he wrote to Lucy and to Washington once more. He wrote to the commander-in-chief to apologize for the delay. He had hoped to have the guns in Cambridge by early January, but he told Washington about the warming temperatures. And he stressed the angst he was going through during this period. He wrote to Washington, "These inevitable delays pain me exceedingly, as my mind is fully sensible of the importance of the greatest expedition in this case. So he wanted his commander-in-chief to know that he wasn't dawdling, he wasn't just twiddling his thumbs. To Lucy, Knox wrote a much longer, more eclectic letter on January 5th. This was his fourth and final missive to her that he wrote during his expedition. But like the others, it began with my lovely and dearest friend. Those people who love as you and I do never ought to part. And then he had to deliver the bad news. It is with the greatest anxiety that I am forced to date my letter from this place, it was in Albany, at this distance from my love, at a time too when I thought I would have happily been in such arms. And then he explained why this was the case, why he could not be with her at that point. The weather for 3 or 4 days past has been intolerably warm considering my wishes. The thaw has been so great that I trembled for the consequences. For without snow, my very important charge cannot get along. And then he turned to her well-being, especially now that she was clearly in her final trimester. And he wrote, I am exceedingly concerned for fear my love should repine at my not being able to come at the time expected. Do not repine, I beseech you. Consider and keep in mind the very happy meeting we shall have after 2 months of very painful absence. So hopefully everyone can sense the obvious trepidation in Knox's voice in both of these letters that he wrote on January 5th. And then, as if to take his mind off of his troubles, that was when he wrote into his account a bit about my travels. That's when he told Lucy about his opinions of New Yorkers. And he also touched on a number of other topics. Now, at last, Henry reluctantly had to close his letter. He was running out of space. It was very, very late. And so he concluded his letter by writing, it is now past 12 o'clock. Therefore, my blessing, I wish for a good night's repose and will mention you in my prayers. Adieu for tonight, adieu. Now, on the night of Saturday, January 6th, and Sunday, January 7th, Knox's patience paid off. A cold front swept over the region, and that sufficiently strengthened the ice over the Hudson River. And on that day, January 7th, Knox, Becker, and his men very carefully escorted 10 sleds eastward over the Hudson River. And by January 9th, 2 days later, all of the guns were safely escorted across. And so Knox at last had his guns on the east side of the Hudson River, and he at last was able to take his leave of General Schuyler and at last able to leave Albany. And he began to head first to the south, to the village of Claverack, before heading eastward once again into the Berkshire Mountains. Now, of course, Knox had no time, no opportunity to write to either Washington or Lucy as he entered the Berkshire Mountains. But he did leave us some very vivid images of this stage of his journey. He left some very vivid images in his diary that he kept, which he probably very likely shared with Lucy upon his return. Now, as Knox and his noble train of artillery, as the sleds followed a one-time Indian trace up into the mountains, they were surrounded by dense evergreen forests on both sides of the Indian trace, the old Indian trace that they were following. But occasionally, the woodlands would part, revealing just incredible vistas that took Knox's breath away. For instance, on the evening of January 10th, Knox wrote in his diary that the expedition, him, his men, the oxen, had climbed mountains from which we might might almost have seen all the kingdoms of the earth. So he was clearly dazzled by the sights he was seeing. But nevertheless, going up and down these treacherous mountains was very, very hard going. And so the next night he wrote, it appeared to me almost a miracle that people with heavy loads should be able to get up and down such hills as are here. So I think this conveys some of the challenges that Knox and his men confronted. But of course, Knox and his men did eventually make it through to the mountains. They exited the mountains, and when they entered the western Massachusetts community of Westfield, and there was a big celebration. The people who lived in Westfield had never seen such guns before, and there was a big party in the tavern, and Knox actually fired one of the guns in celebration. And then the party pushed on to Springfield. Now at Springfield, Knox said farewell to John Becker and his New York Teamsters, and Knox was met by a number of Massachusetts Teamsters. And so Becker disappears from the historical stage, but Knox most certainly does not. Now, after being met by these Massachusetts Teamsters, Knox very quickly pushed to the west. He pushed to the west, to the east, and by the 18th of January, Knox and his sleds had reached Framingham, which was 20 miles west of Cambridge. Now Knox, as soon as he and his guns reached Framingham, Knox left them. He let the men rest, he let the oxen rest, and Knox immediately rode to Watertown, where Lucy was staying during his expedition. Now, unfortunately, we know nothing about their reunion. Obviously, it was a joyous reunion that they were finally at last reunited, but unfortunately, they've left us no account of that reunion. And then Washington rode the 4 additional miles from Watertown to Cambridge, where he reported to George Washington, who was equally overjoyed to see Knox return with those guns. Now, after briefing Washington about the success of his mission, Knox then, his work was hardly done, and he returned to Framingham, where he oversaw the construction of carriages for the guns, and then he oversaw their final transportation to the hills and overlooks surrounding Boston. And then by the end of January, Knox was in the process of actually taking command of his artillery regiment. He was now in charge of his artillery regiment, and now he had to take command of it. And so as February opened, Knox was incredibly busy, but he saw Lucy as much as possible during the month of February, because she was clearly entering her final month of pregnancy. Now, Knox was also busy helping the Continental Army and helping Washington plan the taking of Dorchester Heights. And the taking of Dorchester Heights was made possible only by the success of Knox's mission. And the Dorchester Heights, of course, was unoccupied by either army, but if Knox's guns were positioned on Dorchester, they could compel the British to depart. And so while Knox was busy taking command of his artillery regiment, as well as helping to plan the taking of Dorchester Heights, he got word on February 25th that Lucy had entered pregnancy. Had entered labor, and hence her pregnancy was coming to an end. And so Knox dropped everything, and he immediately put his second in command, Colonel Henry Burback, in charge of his regiment temporarily, and Knox rushed to see his wife in Watertown, which again was 4 miles from Cambridge. And then on February 26th, their baby was born, a little girl whom they called Lucy, who they named Little Lucy, after Lucy Flucker's aunt, Lucy Waldo Winslow was actually the woman who the baby was named after. Now, I think as most of you know, just days after Knox returned to the Army, he returned to the Army on the 27th or 28th of February. He helped Washington in the final preparations for the taking of Dorchester. And on the evening of March 4th, 1776, Knox's guns were placed atop Dorchester Heights in a very secret operation that was very successful. So when the British commander, General William Howe, woke the next morning on March 5th, he saw Knox's guns staring down upon him. And Howe, the British commander, decided that retreat was the better part of discretion was the better part of valor, and he informed Washington that he would be willing to give up the city if Washington let the army go unmolested, and Washington agreed to that plan. And then the British Army did depart on March 17th, 1776. Now, in between March 5th and March 17th, Knox did write a letter to Lucy, in which he explained his absence from her once again. And he wrote to her, "Nothing but an excessive hurry of business has prevented my paying my Lucy that tribute of affection which is so justly due her." And then he continued. He confirmed for her that the strange movements that she and her friends had heard were of the enemy packing up and going off a bag. And there we go. Strange movements of the enemy going off were the enemy packing up, going off bag and baggage. Now, Knox and many in the Continental Army's high command, they felt that as the British fleet sailed across out of sight over the horizon, they realized that the British would be back. And they anticipated the British would not be back at Boston, but they anticipated that the British would return to New York City, including Knox. He felt that the British were going to make an attempt on New York City. And he felt wherever the British went, he had to go. And wherever he went, Lucy would go. And so he finished this letter to her by writing, "My dear Lucy, we must prepare to follow them, the British. As we are citizens of the world, any place will be our home and equally cheap." So even New York would be equally cheap at that point in time. Now, I think this letter is really the capstone of Henry's Ticonderoga expedition. It was certainly one of the great adventure stories of the Revolutionary War. It was also a stupendous logistical achievement on Knox's part. But hopefully you can see by now that it was also a very human story about two people who were very much in love with one another and yet separated by war and conflict. However, they always sought to maintain and preserve their love for one another through their letters. And so I believe this makes this story a universal one and indeed a timeless one. Thank you very much. I think I have some time for some questions from anyone. Yes, sir.
Did the British have any knowledge of Knox's mission when it started?
I don't think so. I've never read anything that the British were realized that Knox, was heading west to Ticonderoga. I've looked at House correspondence with during this period, and he makes no reference to it. And Howe, and as well as the British High Command, was stunned when they saw those guns pointed at them off of Dorchester. Yeah. Yes, sir. Dog says okay. We'll get to you next. Yeah.
You
Go ahead.
mentioned,
Yeah.
you mentioned the letters, right? How long did it take them to get from one place to the other and then back?
That's a very good question. It varied. Because Knox made sure that his letters to Lucy always went with a Washington dispatch, I suspect that she got them quite quickly. But there's no evidence. I mean, she obviously received those letters, but there's no indication as to when she received them.
How did they
Dispatch riders, yeah, that's how they were military dispatch riders that would do that. And Schuyler, made sure that Knox's letters received priority treatment. Yes, sir.
Can you tell a little the story of how Ethan Allen joined up on this expedition, or kind of joined up?
Yeah. Well, Ethan Allen, there is a reference in a letter to Lucy. Actually, I cut this in the interest of time, but I think I do have this slide up there. This is from a letter this is from Henry's January 5th letter to Lucy. And he was writing again about prisoners. And this is from Albany. Now he said, 17 of them set out for Pennsylvania yesterday, among whom was General Richard Prescott, who has by all accounts behaved excessively ill in putting Colonel Ethan Allen of ours, who was taken at Montreal. Allen was captured at Montreal, and he was pretty badly treated by Prescott. Well, Prescott fell into American hands several months later, and the Americans wanted payback. So that's why. So that was the reference to Ethan Allen, but in the correspondence during this period. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Just south of Clifton Park, across the Mohawk River there, he had to somehow, and there's a plaque right there on the road for him. And I'm wondering where they actually crossed the river, because you got all that tide down at Albany. The ice would be pretty broke up. I'm guessing at this, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where they crossed at the Mohawk. The ferry, which they attempted at Half Moon Ferry, and then that's where the ice first broke, and then they moved. According to records I've seen, they moved to Sloss's Ferry, I believe it was called, which was 7 miles to the west, and there the ice was sufficiently thick for the sleds to get across. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where they were, given the changes in topography and the river flow today. It's almost impossible to actually pinpoint it, I believe. Yeah.
That plaque is there.
Well, the plaque is there. The plaque was put up in the 1920s, and so I suspect there was some estimates going on, maybe some guesstimates going on. Well, it's worth a stop there anyway, because you're probably within eyeshot of where it was, but it might not have been right there. So, yes, sir.
I'm wondering why Henry even picked that fight. Why didn't he just follow the old military road from Lake George down to Fort Edward and then proceed down the eastern side of the Hudson River?
I don't know why he did that. Yeah, that's an interesting question. He never really left us an account as to why he chose the routes that he did. The diary that I mentioned is very cryptic. There are some certain passages that are very compelling, but you wish he had more time to fill it out more completely. And the diary has not survived in its entirety. He did not explain the route that he chose to Washington. I suspect he was taking advice from Schuyler and from Becker, because Knox had never been to this area beforehand, and as far as I know, he would never return. So I suspect he was listening to the best people who he could find. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just wondering, the expedition, the idea of the expedition, was that solely from George Washington, or was there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Benedict Arnold claimed credit for it, of course, but I suspect that Knox perhaps came up with it himself, or maybe Washington did. I mean, Knox knew better than most in the Continental Army toward the end of the year just how desperately short of cannon Army was, and everyone in the Continental Army knew about those guns at Ticonderoga by that point in time. And Knox, he had enormous self-confidence in himself, and so I suspect that he presented Washington with a plan of action. It's all speculation on my part, but I suspect he convinced Washington to send him on this expedition because Knox wanted some guns to command after he gained command of the artillery regiment, and Knox was a very thorough planner, and so there was a lot of improvisation in this expedition on his part, but he was also a thorough planner. So I lean toward the fact that he probably came up with this idea and convinced Washington to go with it. Yes, sir, in the back.
Could you talk about the economics of the expedition? Your Knox had been a bookseller, was he compensated for it? And how about Becker and the Teamsters and paying people for the oxen and the sleds?
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic of the story. Washington told Knox to spare no expense for it. Now Knox was receiving his pay as a colonel in the Continental Army, but Washington told Knox to spare no expense, and Knox did. He worked with Schuyler on terms of paying Becker and the Teamsters, and Schuyler was a little more frugal, and Knox, because Schuyler, and I didn't go into this, but Schuyler, according to Henry Knox, Schuyler seemed to be dawdling in terms of getting Henry his sleds as soon as he reached Fort George with the guns, and so Knox, he contracted with a fellow by the name of, I believe it's George Palmer, who is from Stillwater, and Stillwater did not have the best, Palmer did not have the best reputation in this region, and so Schuyler, when he heard of it, he kind of castigated Henry for overpaying Palmer, and he said, he essentially said, you're being taken by Palmer, and Schuyler put a stop to that. But Henry, he felt that time was more important than money in terms of getting those guns to Washington's army, and so they did tussle back and forth. And actually, there was a meeting in Schuyler's mansion in Albany between Palmer, the general, and Henry, and it did not go well for Palmer. To put it mildly, Palmer was sent packing, but I think that Henry, by making that contract, it did get Schuyler to get those sleds to Knox and to pay those Teamsters the money that they demanded. Yes.
Originally, where did the cannons come from? Were they British, French?
Yeah, they were British. I assume that some of them were French. In origin, they were kept there in Ticonderoga. They had been there probably since the end of the French and Indian War. I'm not sure about that, but the Patriot Militia, which included Benedict Arnold, that captured them in May of 1775. They found those guns, and they did tell Washington about those guns, and so that's why Washington got them. But in terms of the origins of them, I'm not sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How did they attribute the miracle of no Tory loyalists during this whole entire encounter of a half-mile-long train of sleds and men and oxen and things to no information was received anywhere by any of the British?
Yeah, and this was a reality that the British had to deal with. They're extending their control and their information networks, beyond the parameters of where their armies were located. I think the British were still kind of dumbstruck by the fact that these rebels were so successfully mobilizing against them.
Even the loyalists who were locals in this entire area of travel
Mhm.
did not at any point
Yeah.
raise an issue or whatever to notify people, even if the British weren't there,
Mhm.
to let them know that they were on the way, to have necessarily attempted to, while they were still on the sleds, stop them in Framingham or Worcester before they were.
Yeah. There's no indication that there was any kind of loyalist activity against Knox and his movement of his cannon. And that is an interesting perspective, yeah.
Phil, I think unless there's one outstanding question left, I think we're going to end the Q&A. Anyone have a final question? There it is.
I want to ask personally, what was it like for you to come here? You take this for granted.
Yeah,
you
this
living
is
here
just an
since
ordinary day.
Oh, yeah. It's, the questioner asked me, what's it like to be here at this time of year?
Just to be.
Oh, yeah, to be here. I've been here before. I've been to this area before. But it's still amazing. But one of the reasons, as I think John pointed out, I wanted to come here was because it is in the winter, and I did want to see the environment as Henry Knox saw it. I've only seen it in the summer, so I've seen it under very different circumstances. But today in particular, as I looked out the window of my hotel room, I could envision Knox and fighting the winds and the snow and trying to get the cannon across the lake. And so it helps me, in terms of the writing process, and it compels me it forces me to try to write in as compelling a fashion as possible. And so I thank you for the beautiful weather yesterday, but I thank you for at least the bout of snow and stuff that we had to deal with this morning. So at any rate,
Thank you, Phil.
very
Let's hear it
much. Thank you very much.
A reminder, as a very wise man likes to say, buy the book.